Show starts in 1 minute. Good evening, folks, and a hearty welcome to our drive-in theater. We have a wonderful evening's entertainment lined up for you, one that will provide several hours of pleasurable relaxation and diversion for you and your family.
Like 9 out of 10 film stars, Raquel Welch uses Lux Beauty Soap.
Well, no, I like to be a woman and a man to be a man, you know.
We hope you'll make this a weekly visit. You love the tasty array of snacks we have to offer. Bring your friends. There are always wonderful new pictures to see. We hope you have a wonderful time.
Hello, and welcome back to another episode of The Longhouse, the weekly show for the most sensible of centrists. This week we are going to be talking about an author by the name of David Fleming, and specifically his book Surviving the Future, which I believe was published after his death. I think he died sometime in 2010, and two of his books, this one included, were published after his death and sort of contain a lot of his views on our current economical issues and possibilities for the future. And speaking of sensible centrists, Ludwig Path, how are you doing?
Yeah, hey, great to be back again, and hello to everybody listening. This is a topic that you picked out. I mean, this is esoteric even for me. I'd never heard about this David Fleming fellow and his slacker economy before.
Yeah,
before you brought it up to me, but I'm
he's
quite
a bit of a
excited
character, and he's been moving sort of a bit behind the scenes in a lot of stuff. I would definitely categorize him as an old school green guy. I think he would be very much against sort of what we think about when we think about the modern quote unquote green industry. And then again, he is the one who is credited with the invention of what is it, tradable? What's the name of it? Tradable energy something. Let me find it. Energy quotas, which in many ways have backfired in trying to reduce the amount of environmental impact a lot of companies have.
Is that the same as carbon credit?
Yes, it's a variation of that. Yeah.
Huh.
Like a precursor, maybe?
Yes. And of course, Liquid Swan. Welcome back to the show.
I guess I jumped the gun there. Yeah, thanks for having me.
Hopefully, we'll be able to glean something from this. And he was also actually before that, real quick, Ludwig Path. Speaking of sensible centrism, you've been going on a bit of a tear the past couple of days, being especially centrist, especially sensible, I think, on your Twitter. So for anyone who isn't following Ludwig Path on Twitter, they should do so. And of course, follow me as well if you don't already. Liquid Swan, do you have any socials you would like to plug?
I just have proxarchy.com. I write there along with a bunch of other guys, and I have my own Substack, lordwallaceswan.substack.com, and then my Twitter is @liquidswan. So that's it.
Very good. If you're listening to this and you're not subscribed, please consider subscribing. Remember to like the video, comment if you find anything interesting, and all that stuff. That helps us out with the algorithm. Keeps the lights on, so to speak, here on streaming from StreamYard. All right. Yes, I have a small presentation here, and I think we want to start with talking about who this guy is in general. And I hinted at this already, but he's a bit of a character. He's a bit of a strange fellow. But he's very much old school in his green outlook on life. or on the economy. And I think, as I said, were he alive today, and were he able to dig into how sort of the green industry works these days, um, the ESG managerialistic version of everything he's been talking about all his life. The old thing about rolling in his grave and all that. I don't think he would enjoy what it has become, and indeed, a lot of his writings is, at least in Surviving the Future, when he's uh, describing what he calls the market economy, he's in a sense describing what we would call neoliberalism, um, the system that we live under today. Anyway, this guy was he was a writer, economist, and he worked a lot with the UK Green Party. I think he was a founding member of the Green Party, and he was a spokesperson for them for many years. Excuse me. And spent basically his whole life championing a vision of a future with an economy that would focus on the local aspects, the local society, the local economy, and protection of the local and the knowable. And it is very interesting to read his book because I find myself agreeing with a lot of his conclusions, but disagreeing with the path he takes. So maybe some of you will agree once we get into it.
So just a few questions. Could this guy be classified as a deep ecologist, like someone like Arne Næss, for example?
I suppose he could, but obviously he's not as we've previously also streamed about someone like Linkola, who could in theory be called a deep ecologist, but he doesn't end up being defeatist about it. What David Fleming bases all of his theories on is the idea that the economy, the world we live in right now, has to collapse at some point. I can't nail down whether or not he believes that is through something like climate change, right? And I don't want to get into all of that. I'm just trying to lay out the way he thinks. But the general point that you need to understand that he believes is that he thinks that the current version of our economy is unsustainable. And at some point, it's going to collapse. And he flip-flops a bit on how, let's say, violent that collapse might be, and spends a lot of his time defining what comes after may look like, if that makes sense.
It's interesting too, because I read a little bit about him before the show. I wonder if he was able to see so there's this birth rate issue all around the world where the birth rates are shrinking so much. I wonder if he ever was able to take that into account in his books. I haven't read them.
That is
Obviously,
interesting as well, but you would find a lot of overlap with these things with stuff that we are saying in our sphere, just from a different perspective, right? He's coming at this from a very, and I'm not saying that you're not allowed to be right wing and have pro environmentalist stances. I think that is something that should, in theory, go hand in hand. I think a lot of right wingers should be comfortable with prioritizing their own local environment and society at the expense of large multinational corporations that are extracting and damaging your homeland, right?
Yeah.
And viewed through that lens, you'll find yourself agreeing a lot with David Fleming, at least in his conclusions, as I said.
Well,
So
it makes sense in our
on a scale from 1 to 10, how much of a doomsayer is this guy? If 10 is like Paul Ehrlich and well, 1 is just total normie.
He's his basic outline is the economy is going to collapse to the point where you will have no choice but to rely on your local economy and your local society. And how can you then rebuild that society and economy in a way that is sustainable and prosperous? So there's no question to him that this is going to break at some point, but he spends, as far as I understand, quite very little time in the book that I have talking about specifically how this will happen. He's more concerned with the fact that it's going to happen and how you're going to rebuild.
So he's sort of a medievalist in some sense.
In a sense, yes, you'll find a lot of overlap, but it brings forth a very interesting. It brings forth a very interesting sort of dichotomy that might exist within the online right, in that a lot of people would say that they agree with him that what we're doing is unsustainable, or you can say that some people think that this can be worked through. Like you have a lot of people who call themselves nowadays right-wing progressivists. I mean, we've had one on our show at some point, right? In which they think that we can actually go with the flow of our sort of ever-expanding economy and leverage technology in a way that'll allow us to stave off that collapse, while the other half would, whether it's through spiritual means, like someone like Spengler or someone like David Fleming, would say that no, what we're doing is unsustainable and it's a matter of time until it all collapses. And what Fleming does is basically present a positive vision of, all right, how do we rebuild? And QWERTY CC7 says it's called conservation, not environmentalism. All right, conservation is probably a better word. I'll take that. So, real quick, I think I want to just touch on this book, because this book is a bit weird, because the original book that David Fleming wrote was called Lean Logic. Let me get the full title. Lean Logic. Lean Logic, a dictionary for the future and how to... that did not work. A dictionary for the future and how to survive it. That's the original title. Now, that was literally a dictionary. The whole book is written like a dictionary, in that he defines words and then he writes, he names a word, and then he writes a definition for what this means in the future society he's envisioning. And so this book, Surviving the Future, is a mix of sort of his writings, a mix of that book, and a mix of all of this from people that worked with him, and it's been restructured into a more coherent book, let's put it like that. so he's actually arguing stuff, instead of just defining random words, because it makes it hard to follow his logic when a word on the first page is relevant to the word on the last page, right?
Yeah, that's a very strange style.
Yeah, it is. Now, there is something to be said, I guess, about doing it that way that might have benefited him and his style. But I found that when I was looking into it, I was looking for which book to get. I figured I'm going to get this one because I'm going to get the one I can sort of read linearly, and try to understand where he's coming from in his arguments. Okay. So we touched on this a little bit, but in this book, he defines something he calls the lean economy. And his focus, as I said, is on this post-collapse survival. He uses the word climacteric, which is, I think, the scientific word or something for, people say like every 7 years, your body effectively changes because by that time, all of the cells in your body has been replaced or something like that. That's pretty much the meaning of the word. It's the changing of a system and organism over time. So he's I think purposefully being a bit vague about what the collapse would look like, but he's absolutely sure that whatever we're doing now is not sustainable. It's not gonna last, and it's going to lead to an economical collapse, which would mean that you won't be able to get stuff that you are used to getting. And he specifically, we're talking about food, materials, resources, etc. So he's not sort of hiding that probably as a part of this, someone should die or has to die. What's the meme? Billions must die.
Perhaps.
Yes.
One
But
billion?
he seems also very purposeful in not being a doomsayer about this. He's sort of like stating this as a matter of fact at the beginning, that this is my working thesis, that things are going to collapse. It's going to shake up the economy so much that we're going to have to scale back drastically. That's the words that he used. And in this, he writes on what he calls the slack economy, and how he defines that in opposition to market economics. And so I want to read a bit, and feel free to jump in at any point, because I want to read first how he defines market economics, and then how he sort of paints an alternative to these protocols, as he calls them. All right. So a protocol for lean economies. The conventional economist's ideal of a perfect competition can be summarized in 7 conditions. In order for it to exist, there must be 1. No local intervention, such as government regulations to set standards, and no discrimination except on grounds of price against another producer. 2. Standardized products, so that all products compete on price rather than on differences in specification. 3. A large number of sellers and buyers, and all of roughly same size, so that none of them can influence prices. 4. Free entry and exit. Sellers and buyers can come and go as they wish. 5. Profit maximization. Sellers do not have any agenda other than making money. Buyers are irresistibly drawn to the best deal. 6. A perfect mobility of the factors of production, so that labor, capital, and land are distributed according to price. They are free from other entanglements and strings. And 7. Perfect knowledge, so that buyers can perfectly evaluate the quality of all products on the market. Now, then he goes on to say a little bit about how these protocols are a bit of a pipe dream, and that economists themselves, according to David Fleming, don't really believe that, or don't really work from an idea that this is achievable all at once. But that's sort of the basis for him saying, all right, but then I'm going to try to define something that's more realistic. So here's the alternative.
So right now you described the market economics, right?
This is the market economics according to David Fleming.
I see.
And I would agree with a lot of these points. If there's anyone in the chat that is economically aligned, please let us know if he's missing out on anything. But what I can remember from my economics lessons, that he seems to hit all the points. So this is his alternative. The lean economy, by contrast, will violate all 7 conditions listed. The impediments to perfect competition will be greater than ever, and this will be intentional. There will be slack. The ideal conditions of the post-market economy, those of intelligent imperfect competition, are summarized here. So, number 1, in Greenerva says, and that's true, he's basing this off of the Chicago School of Economics. But to be fair, Chicago School is the most prevalent one in our current society, as far as I understand, at least.
Oh, it's the Keynesian.
Exactly, yeah. So, in opposition to no local intervention, he writes, local intervention. Protection is the act of caring for something which you value, or for which you are responsible. It is a deep behavior which in some senses is shared by all living things. It is widely supposed to be a good thing, except in the case of economies, which are required to dance to the single tune of perpetual competition. It's true, natural selection is a condition of all living things too, but species with less intelligence than ours use both. It is time we caught up. On such matters, market economics is far from neutral. It takes the view that the competitive market is the only sound basis for economy. politics, and culture, and it advocates its case with evangelical conviction. If there is a society somewhere which is not based on the market, it needs to be saved. All of the 7 points of this protocol for lean economies are implicitly or explicitly about the task of protecting the right of such economies to proceed on different bases. In a taut, competitive, growing market, it is true that protectionism is not a good idea. It reinforces inefficiencies and it reduces the incentives for improvements in quality, economies of scale, and reductions in price. It discourages the development of technical advantages and specialist skills, and it freezes the flow of trade and capital, setting up conditions for national and global unemployment. But of course, there are circumstances in which free, unprotected trade is not what an economy needs, and we are coming to a time when they can be discussed without inviting derision. One of them occurs where an underdeveloped, thus far uncompetitive economy needs time to get its industries established before exposing them to international competition. In the early years, a developing region with an industry which is still too new to have developed competitive levels of efficiency is unlikely to survive without some advantage, such as a weak currency or a tariff protection. Another case where unprotected trade is not what is needed is when we need to move away from the commitment to growth, i.e., to the rubbing out of diversity and local self reliance, to resource depletion, pollution, the loss of social capital and resilience, and eventual collapse. It is too late to consider protection against these things. The damage has already been done. But protection of what is left of indigenous food production and steps towards reduced dependence on fossil fuels would be rational. Okay, any thoughts?
Well, there's a lot. I mean, I guess I agree with him. Economics can just be such a very contentious topic.
That's
And
true.
it's so abstract as well. When you're trying to discuss these things, as to you just get into like these balls and webs of abstraction. You can't really get anything out of it. But yeah, what he's trying to say here is like, okay, maybe sometimes you can't really have this pure market system. And of course, I think most people in the audience agree when they heard the stuff that he was talking about. Yeah, we should have local interference and protect these kind of indigenous markets, indigenous producers, and so on. They're just hearing nationalism. You have more of this
Exactly. Yeah.
the ethno-nat crowd would be
Yes.
just kind of slobber all over this.
Uh-huh.
So that's what I was thinking, is that it opens the door for that.
Well, to me, like the Austrian school is mostly just like lay out, like say like a perfect system under perfect conditions or whatever. But you still, especially for people like us, we really appreciate the particular over the general. And if you look at the Austrian system, it's really about if you generalize it, obviously, it's about the general. But having that particular, like protecting the locals and whatnot in your own society from sort of like, like let's say the market decides that we should have drag shows at local libraries, maybe we can be particular about that and not allow it to happen, sort of thing. Oh wait.
Sorry, I was muted. Yes. Exactly. He's very much but he's going very hard on this localism thing, as you said, Ludwig Path, to the point where you will draw in the nationalism crowd. And I think someone like Fleming would be open to trade between nations, but he would discourage it and say that in the post-collapse economy, this wouldn't be possible for a long time, essentially.
Well, yeah, it'd be hard to travel long distances, I suppose, without some sort of fuel source, and that takes specialization.
It might not even be economically efficient. I mean, if the trade routes, if all of the infrastructure is broken down, and you don't have the global kind of military insurance to travel around, it's not as economically beneficial to have these globalized supply lines as it is currently.
And it's also the idea of the loss of social capital in removing money from a local economy. He writes here a bit further on, under the same point, on trust. Money will have a much reduced significance in a local lean economy. Prices don't work well in a slack economy because If everything were priced, slack would mean high prices, and there is always the temptation to give into a buyer's pressure to reduce the price, especially if the buyer is out from outside the community. In a lean economy, a culture of cooperation and reciprocity, exchange involving money is not the rule, but a backup. The significance of such a change is hard to overstate. The market economy's money exchange is impersonal until they get into the bigger long-term transactions, such as rent or employment. The two sides of a money transaction don't have to trust each other. And even then, there are ways of dealing with the situation if things go wrong. In contrast, the informal economy of the neighborhood would break down immediately in the absence of trust. It is the core economy consisting of all the things we do for each other as families: cooking, bringing up children, playing, discussing citizenship, building character and emotional literacy, all the things that we do as citizens, etc., etc. And then he's just listing like school governors, organizing society, sports clubs, etc., etc. The lean economy will depend on the informal economy, and it will in turn depend on sustainable trust, the confidence that an obligation, explicit or implied, will be honored.
The question, does he say how big these local communities will be?
I think he hints to it at some point. I can't find any like specific quote for you right now. But my understanding is that they are villages, pretty much.
Yeah, no, that makes sense. But I mean,
that's what he's talking about.
I think if you go hard against currency, and I don't just mean like dollars or whatever, but whether you want to do like seashells or like post-apocalyptic bottle caps or something. I mean, if you're dropping if you're dropping currency, you're basically like scaling down society to maybe like 100 people at once,
Yes.
because and anything above that is just not going to be possible if you don't have any kind of token of exchange or token of trust. As I would think of these things. But again, this is like this is probably way more ethno-nationalist or sort of tribalist than a lot of the ethnonats would be. So it's it's interesting so far. I'm not sure he even thinks like that. I don't know what
he does envision. Yeah. It seems like he envisions a sort of like a network of sort of cooperating like this. You're getting into like what defines a nation, right? What is that except a network of villages who have all agreed to cooperate, right?
But of course, like the nation state as we know it is much bigger than that. I mean, even that's going to require a certain infrastructure. So this is like way
so maybe
even
you could
lower
go back to you talked about like a medievalist, like the patchwork sort of style of thinking about this, because he goes into stuff talking about when he talks about trust later on even more. He talks about how you would have to basically do some of this. He's very strange in a lot of his writing because he will write one thing where it's very obvious that he's thinking from a bottom-up perspective, but then he'll write another thing like a page later where it's very obvious that he's thinking of a top-down perspective. and I'm not really sure how this sort of bottom-up spontaneous cohesiveness is going to happen. And then he writes, but you're going to need to place your trust in some leader, right? That's just something you're going to have to do.
So in some sense, he's sort of like that would be sort of a medievalist view. Like you'd put your trust in like your baron or king.
Exactly. Let me check if there's anything I want to. The next point he writes, which is the rejection of the market economics, is product diversity. I'm not sure if that's very interesting. Let me double check. No, I don't think that's very interesting, to be honest.
Can you just summarize, perhaps?
Yes. Let me see if I can find part of it that summarizes it. It's basically saying that you have to embrace product diversity to not have these products be interchangeable, right? Does that make sense?
Yeah, I mean, of course, if you just have this kind of localist community, then all you're going to get is product diversity. If nobody's like, if there's no currency and nobody's enforcing any type of standard, then you're just going to get like the flavor of the day, whether it's like the meat pies or the socks or whatever, the shoes. It's all everything's going to be unique to whatever particular circumstance.
And he uses that to sort of imply that sort of the side effect of loyalty between customer and provider is more important than a plethora of products, of interchangeable products. Not to say that we have really that many sort of interchangeable products in our current economy. I mean, it's been a frequent talking point in our circles that if you go into the supermarket, I mean, you're really picking from like 3 producers, right?
Yeah,
It's
who
just
are
different
making
packaging.
but they're making interchangeable products. That's kind of the point, isn't it? That they're, everybody's making the same thing. You can sort of keep
Yeah,
the
and then
prices
they're like
low because
faking that is different. Yeah.
yes, but that's kind of the point, right? Because it's available everywhere and it's always the same.
Yeah.
And that's why it's cheap and easy. So, like, I think
homo.
yeah, but that's kind of the thing that it's easy to crap on as sort of like the global homo stuff, but there is something to be said for that it is quite convenient. I think most people would miss it, honestly. I mean, if we were to end
yeah,
up in
to be
this place, it's
sure.
like
Yes.
it's very easy to take it for granted that okay, maybe you don't buy like the Big Macs or whatever, but that I could go to the market and get a pack of eggs, for example, and they're consistent size, and I know that they've been checked for, they've been washed and they've been checked so there's no hatchlings in
Yes,
the eggs
definitely.
and so on. And
Yes.
it's sort of the same price, the same packaging. I know what I'm getting.
But I mean, that's
So-
what he's saying about the imperfect products would lead to interpersonal loyalty, right? If you buy from Farmer John and your son dies of, uh, um, bird flu
AIDS.
or something, yeah, there's going to be a a connection between you and Farmer John to the point where Farmer John's going to be driven out because he's providing he's providing shitty eggs.
it's the free market at work.
It's
There's
it's
accountability.
a weird sort of like you're taking free market principles and applying it just in very small doses, right? To very small economies.
Yeah, I mean, of course, these market principles, they are just general principles that sort of apply
Of
forever. I
course.
mean, you don't trust people who give you bad products, so
No.
it's really just okay. It's just gonna be trust based. There's no standard. But that's just how a natural, let's say, like a third world country or developing nation, that's how it's going to happen. If they build up an economy, it's just going to be based on whoever is like giving you the food that's not poisoning you. They're probably going to win out
Yes.
in the marketplace over time.
That reminds me, my brother went to Vietnam and he said he was walking from his like hotel or whatever going into town, and there was like this I guess meat salesman like cooks the meat for you, sitting on the side of the sidewalk, and he just has a pile of meat like pork, just it's a pile like 4 feet high, all sliced up, just sitting on the sidewalk, and he's like trying to sell it to people, but by the time he got back at the end of the day, it was all gone. So someone was buying it. So there must be some insane amount of trust there.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah, because who from the West would eat that?
Or an insane amount of hunger.
Yeah.
Which both might be true. Okay. And then he says that it has to comprise of small numbers of sellers and buyers, which is a rejection of a large numbers of sellers and buyers of the roughly the same size of the sort of utopic market economics. The divided self of the market economy shows in the fact that the laws of competition apply only to production and not to consumption. While producers are under pressure to be efficient to maximize output from a given input, consumers are under corresponding pressure to be inefficient to maximize their input for a given output, so consumption for well-being, so as to soak up the ever-growing production which the economy needs as a condition of its stability. I really like this line because it's sort of like an economic explanation of sort of why it's been so much pressure on sort of creating the perfect consumer, right? The market economy or neoliberalistic economy as it exists has to create the perfect consumer to be able to continue to grow, right?
Yeah.
The American empire could get away with it in the post-war era because the demand was actually real, right? But once that's gone, you need to create that demand in people.
I mean, I've talked about that concept multiple times, but I've never used the term consumer efficiency before. So it's a very
No,
it
and I
sounds
like that word. It's very
yeah.
sinister. It's very
It's interesting.
managerial. We've
I feel like in
optimized
Europe,
consumer efficiency.
I feel like in Europe the consumer efficiency is much higher than in like in North America.
Based
Maybe.
on what?
I don't know. The fatness. I think the fatness in the States and Canada.
Well, that means they're more consumer efficient, right? Because I think what Fleming says here is that if you're less consumer efficient, you can make the food last longer.
Yeah.
Like more efficiency means that you're consuming more. It's like you're the guy
If
with the
you're an efficient
most
consumer
yeah.
for an efficient consumer for McDonald's gets McDonald's every day, right?
Oh, okay.
Because that
I was
means
saying,
that McDonald's can operate more efficiently as a seller, right?
I was thinking more of it meant like you're sort of eating or consuming the correct amount of whatever suited to your needs versus um, converting McDonald's hamburgers into sewage.
Yeah, no, this term is like I imagine just like a swarm of termites who are eating houses, and the efficiency is like how quickly they're able to consume the
Quicker the
house.
termites eat,
Yeah.
the faster we can build a new house, right?
The one with the most Funko Pops wins, basically. It's so that's it's a nice term. I almost don't want to use it because it's just too sanitized. It sounds too positive for what it is.
Exactly. He writes a bit more on this, but to summarize, he goes in on sort of returning to the household and its place in the community as more of an economic unit than an individual consumer, because the individual consumer, paradoxically enough, becomes very impersonal, right? As the economy grows.
Yeah, he
or the
keeps
market
getting
grows.
based stars here from the trads and the ethnonats. I mean, I don't know if that, like, again, if this is something he's doing intentionally, but just breaking down the kind of economic system and revealing what comes after, you're sort of seeing how much
I don't
modernity is
know, but
connected to
that's
the
why I'm
economy.
talking about this book, because I found it very interesting that he's just saying a lot of things from a perspective that I hadn't thought of before, where it's like, yeah, I agree with that. And then he's like, and yeah, it's going to happen because, climate change or something. I'm like, okay, sure, I guess. But I mean, it's a very utopian view, obviously. Okay, and so here we have one I might actually be able to show, because I used a Twitter thread to just catalog some of this. So I might actually just bring up a tweet so you guys can read along. Just a moment. Board Brennan says, for 50 Norwegian kroner, thank you so much. I know how little the Norwegian krona is worth nowadays, so those hard-earned money are very much appreciated. I see the return of medieval punishments and law after the return of distributism happens. Maybe. We'll see. And I will say, while I'm just fiddling around with this, Fleming is very much a boomer in his mindset. So it's very surprising to me how he's sort of like ended up with saying a lot of these things, as you say, like you're getting base stars, when his idea is some weird sort of bottom-up hippie approach.
Yeah,
to
I mean, I imagine, like, if you ask him, like, yeah, but you're still gonna have rainbow coalitions. You're still gonna have like free homosexuality in this community.
He has a point on multiculturalism later, where he says you might be able to have multiculturalism. It's going to take a lot of work, or you're just going to have to segregate along cultural lines. That's pretty much his stance on it. So,
which is just true,
yeah. Again, more based than I would assume. So this is against, obviously, free entry and exit into the economy. Now, this is something that I think Academic Agent talked about and has been getting pushback on, is implementing laws to prevent entry and exit of capital into a country. It's something China is doing, I think, as well. They have like two currencies to try to sort of keep the wealth inside the country as much as possible. So, barriers to entry and exit. There are two types of relationships between customers and suppliers. First, there is exit, to get out at the first sign of bother. This is how the market economy is meant to work. Secondly, there is voice, to argue for change, to influence matters by getting involved rather than by walking away, to stay loyal. Such loyalty is a vital asset in the lean economy, and it's given a powerful helping hand by barriers to exit, where conditions exist which makes it hard to get out. One barrier which has shown itself to be effective in many cases in the market economy is geographical remoteness. The decline and fall of the small island economy of Inishbofin, I'm sorry, off the west coast of Ireland illustrates this. With local economic self-sufficiency in virtually all their needs, the islanders maintained a millennium or two of resilience until the coming of the market economy. Inishbofin's low-tech fishing boats were no match for the trawlers. Its farmers, who needed to sell at least some of their output in mainland Ireland in order to buy the goods they needed, were no match for industrial agriculture. And as the islanders, as consumers, became aware of the market's products and prices, they had, as producers, less and less to offer. They resisted for a time, since the island's remoteness provided a big incentive to rely on what it could produce for itself, but when the lower prices, the wider range of goods, and the convenience of market in mainland Ireland was made more accessible by a massive EU-funded pier, that was the end. So Fleming is arguing that you should erect barriers to entry and exit into the economy. And he says, not, let me check here. Decisions which have profound long-term consequences are often made on the strength of short-term opportunities, which, with hindsight, made people would not have chosen. And barriers to entry and exit, such as the inconvenience of living on an island without a modern pier, or of living in a remote area without a modern road, mean that the temptation to take the actions which will destroy the local economy does not arise. That's pretty much a summary of what he's talking about here. I mean, he goes further into detail, but we're going to have to keep moving.
Yeah, well, I mean, I would like maybe to comment a little bit on this because, I mean, this signifies a very stark divide inside of these communities between the more ethno-nationalistic crowds and the sort of libertarian, ex-libertarian NRX crowd, right? Like you have the Peter Thiel faction of libertarians who are trying to do, like with Moldbug, trying to do this patchwork project, you know, where they're going to put up these private cities where they say that like exit is the only right that you have, in a sense. And that's kind of their big thing, is that you should always be able to just say that I'm out and leave.
Yeah.
If you're a part of some kind of private community or a corporation or so, and that's sort of a right that you always have. But with I think with the ethno-nats, they would very much not want to enable exit. You know, you want to try to foster more loyalty and you know, the use of voice and compromise
the only,
like within, yeah.
You know, in a global economy such as ours, the only one who gains by something like brain drain, we were talking about Canadian doctors before we went on air, is the bigger economy, right?
Mm-hmm.
So
same with immigration too.
Exactly. Cordy's EZ7 for 5.5 Canadian dollars says, Bard's idea reminds me of how the size and power of the state directly influences the justice. The state feels invincible. We have less strict laws. Oh, I see. Yeah. I feel I'm getting hints of a narco tyranny. If anyone can back me up on that. No? Okay.
I'm not sure I understood it. Can you bring it up again? I'll have to read it a third time here.
He's saying that the bigger, or the bigger the state seems to become, or the more powerful the state seems to become, the less strict some laws seem to be.
Shouldn't they become more strict or something? Or are you talking about, like, say, if you have like a dictatorial system, then you have some kind of like absolute power for the state, and they don't have to care for the individual? You might have to send another comment to clarify this one, because I'm not sure.
I'll keep a lookout. You don't have to pay for it. Just post it in the chat.
Yeah, we'll bring it up.
Board says what Fleming is talking about here isn't new. Chesterton's distributism is pretty much the same thing. I would agree. What I find interesting is mostly the angle in which Fleming is attacking this, and that's why I found this book interesting.
Yeah, I wish I could comment some more on this in terms of like the distributism bit. I mean, I've watched Dave the Distributist a lot, but he doesn't have any videos actually explaining distributism. But from what I understand, it's like the sort of like what is that, like one cow in a patch of one cow in an acre or something? It's that you're supposed to have this economy where you're supposed to distribute some private property to every individual, but avoid these kind of consolidations of one property owner owning everything and so on. Very much in
Yes.
a sort of religious context. Usually, it's sort of in
Yeah.
service of a religious lifestyle. So I don't know if it's exactly the same thing. It sounds a little bit different to me.
So Jay Green River writes, Fleming is correct. You need to erect barriers for your community. See how the Japanese are operating. Yes. And Theo Kerner says, while Fleming is not incorrect, the barricades will stop working in the context of a globalized tech economy. You can't mine lithium in Ireland. That is true, but you have to understand, Fleming is arguing from a post global economy. He's arguing from the point that whatever we have now is not sustainable. And you can choose to agree or disagree with that. But I mean, to understand his arguments, you're going to have to at least accept his premise.
Yeah. It won't matter if we can't get lithium because we won't need lithium.
Right. Because there won't be any, there won't be any power to run the computers or the batteries. But you could potentially, actually Green River says this, fuck lithium, find an alternative. Your computers might be bigger, but so what? I mean, in Fleming's world, it's not saying that a lot of the things that we know today might not have analogies, right? But they would be they would have to be constructed from a more sustainable, both in terms of social and spiritual perspective, but also environmental. Okay, so let me check here. Let's skip ahead a bit in the interest of time to barriers of mobility, which is relevant to what we were talking about here. Let me just bring up, see if I have one of these. Oh, I think we have right now. That's good. So, in barriers of mobility, he is talking more basically on the same thing, but he's not talking about the exit in terms of like a single individual or a single economic unit removing itself. He's talking in the macroeconomic terms of labor, capital, and land, which he says will all be scarce. Let me check if there's anything we want to. Nope, I want to talk about what he defines as the 6 forms of capital, he calls them. He says the size, growth, and technical powers of the market economy have insulated us for a time from having to think about the limits to the various kinds of capital we depend on. Therefore, there therefore seems to be no need to think about the cost of protecting them. Maybe we can all be free riders, benefiting from assets which we haven't done nothing to produce or protect. We can affirm a liberal right to be a free rider. It is an attractive and inclusive philosophy. It would be immoral to disagree with it, until, that is, it comes face to face with the laws of physics. So here's the 6 forms of capital in his in his version of the lean economy. Natural capital, the living ecology which nature provides, including soil fertility, water, fish, material resources, the whole of the ecosystem and its climate, the essential conditions for a living earth. Human capital, people and their capabilities, qualities, and knowledge, health, intelligence, education, character, skills, beauty, etc. Human capital has an important potential for growth, both through reproduction and hard work. That hard work can itself multiply by making tools and technologies for which, if enough natural capital is available, can then in turn produce more tools and technologies, an amplifying, aka positive, feedback loop. Social capital. The typical textbook definition is, quote, the set of institutions and customs which organize economic activity. But the textbook's authors are thinking of the market economy as the well-behaved process by which society is sustained. For surviving the future, by contrast, what matters is the community itself, Social capital is the social life and living essence of a community, the relationships, humor, and good faith, the common culture and ceremony, the play and the conversation. And it is the organ grinder, the market, and it is the organ grinder, the market economy that is the monkey. I'm not quite sure what this, if this is like a misprint, but or maybe it's like a saying of like, or grinding a monkey, like
No,
how the so.
there's this old thing, like a guy would like turn a crank and it would make music, and then he'd have a monkey that would dance.
Ah, okay, I see.
Yeah.
Oh, that kind of organ. Okay, it's not like your internals. Ah, well, that
Yeah.
That's what I thought too. That's pretty
Yeah,
bizarre,
well,
actually.
that's the difficulties of not, English not being your native tongue. All right,
That's why I'm here.
very good. Scientific or cultural capital, the information and culture available to be grasped and or applied. It is only capital to society that can understand and or use it. Material capital, buildings, roads, equipment, computers, and our networks, etc. But again, for something to qualify as capital, the conditions must exist in which it is useful. For example, energy famine could cause oil-fueled equipment to cease to qualify as any sort of capital. Cars could become simply rather curious-shaped objects. Financial capital. There is a case for omitting financial capital because its value depends on and is a representation of the existence of the other 5 forms. It is included because, to some extent, its existence is independent. A financial crash can occur for reasons notionally unconnected with the other 5. The connections, however, would be revealed as the crisis rippled through to the point of greatly reducing or destroying other forms of capital. So it is useful to have in the list, despite the double counting. All right. Any comments?
I have one about the was it the the first one that you mentioned? What was that?
Natural capital, the land, or the
no,
human?
the infrastructure.
Oh, the
So
material capital, buildings, roads, equipment. Yep.
Yeah, so I wrote a piece about this on my Substack, with sort of like I showed it to Morgoth and he kind of spread it around, but basically the way in Canada, for example, we're bringing in so many immigrants every year. I think every 3 years we increase our population by 10% at the current rate. That like our infrastructure is not keeping up, so everything's getting more and more expensive. And I use an analogy with water. So because water is sort of one of those things you can't really expand without. So realistically, like your water would probably, all your resources would go into water if you needed to. But if you had to see your infrastructure develop evenly across the board, so that water was the same development as everything else at current rates, if you need 2 liters of water and that's what you're being supplied today, you get supplied more because it's Canada. But let's just say, for example, you got 2 liters today. Next, in 3 years, so I call that cycle 1, you would have 1.84 liters of water, and then you'd have 1.64, and then by the time you got 30 years down the road, you actually have no water and you owe 800 mils. Obviously, that's just the analogy can't go that far, but
it's a projection, right? But
yeah,
it sort of goes hand in hand with a bit. I'm reading a lot of Ed Dutton lately because we're going to have him on our show, I think, in 2 weeks.
Oh, wow.
To talk about the case of the people trying to what was their names? Do you remember, Logic Path?
The Malcolm, I don't remember. What was his why do I keep forgetting names? Like these elite breeders, it's been the article, the pronatalists.
Yes, it's these elites who are breeding to save humanity.
Yeah.
The
semi, they look like soys, but they're not.
Yes. And in
Malcolm and Suzanne Collins, that's right. The couple. But I mean, it's not going to be about them specifically, but more about the kind of like ideas that they're putting forward, and we're going to try to have Dutton boot check some of these ideas,
exactly,
see if they make sense.
And I was reminded of one thing, which is probably one of his most famous books, which or his famous studies, I guess, the result of his research, which is, I think it's the Wits End book, At Our Wits End, which talks about how people have gradually, well, he's not saying stupider. He would arrest me on that, but the IQ levels of our society is gradually reducing, and that also has an impact on the creation and sustainability of our infrastructure. So
Yeah.
you're saying that the water there's a projections of lesser water. Well, that's based on what our ability to operate these systems at current point. What is our ability to operate these systems as a society in 10 years, right?
Yeah.
In
Well, they want to
in
bring
one generation is better
they
to
want to
say.
bring
Right.
they want to bring 100 million people into Canada or have a population at that rate by 2100, but at current rates it's going to be there by 2053. So you bring in half a large portion of sub-Saharan Africa. I wonder what that will do to your infrastructure.
Sure, yes, that too, right?
Yeah.
They're not sending their best, as the saying goes.
Yeah.
Anyway, then I want to just skip ahead a little bit, just in the interest of time. And a very interesting economical tool that you guys might be interested in from this book is what he calls the intensification paradox. Now, this is in general, he just talks about the post-market economics, but the intensification paradox talks about the sort of the marginal productivity, I guess, of the marginal productivity of improving. So let me just read this. It is the observation that a developing economy whose productivity is improving actually requires increasing quantities of labor and land and capital to keep each individual supplied with food and shelter. Talking about like supplying people with water, right?
Yeah.
At first, this seems odd, because those productivity improvements, perhaps to improve technology, should mean a significant increase in output per person, which surely represents an improvement in efficiency. The explanation is that the increased output goes primarily into creating and maintaining what can be termed intermediate goods: aqueducts, transport, landfill sites, administration, etc. That is, all that new stuff which the individual never actually gets to consume, but which becomes necessary infrastructure for keeping the developing and intensifying economy in existence. So here we discover a crucial distinction between a labor-saving productivity advance and an intensifying productivity advance. And he goes on to talk more about this, but he has something he calls the story of pots, which is complication builds from an innocent desire. So the first step is that I want to make more pots, which requires more transportation, which requires more transport infrastructures, i.e. roads, which means more tax to pay for said roads, which means more bureaucracy to be able to raise the taxes, which means that there are more jobs available in cities, which means that the cities grow larger, which means that you get a dislocation of rural social structures, which means a relaxation of sexual rules, which means higher population, which means greater need for food and resources, which means military power and conquest, which means flow of wealth into a growing society, which means more pots.
Billions must pot.
Billions must pot. Billions
The
must.
line must go up. The
line must
look
go
at how
up.
many pots. Look at how many the gross pot
But
production.
it's an interesting sort of tool in your tool belt to be able to think about. All right, well, how many layers or chains of non-productivity, in air quotes, do this product have to go through to end up at me, right? Or the consumer in general. And what would life look like if I didn't have that option of that product, right? If you go to the supermarket, you can buy bread that hasn't been like if you go to the fancy supermarkets, at least here in Norway, they'll have local bakeries or they'll have internal bakeries in the store who bake bread every day. But you can also buy like pre-baked bread that gets shipped out every morning from like some like massive factory somewhere, right? What would life look like if you didn't have access to that type of bread, right? Because a large part of that is not making a lot of bread, it's getting the bread to you at that moment, right?
Mm-hmm. Makes sense.
potty trained. In the chat. I need to stop reading chat. All right, I've sort of just there's a lot more to this book, so we might have to do like a part 2 of the stream. But he then goes into, because we're only at chapter 3. But to be fair, the last part of this book is basically how do we get there, which I find incredibly dull. So we might be able to get through by just doing like a part 2 next time or something.
Yeah, just to follow up on this sort of complexity thing, I'm not sure. Like, I think I understood it, but like my impression is really that it's not really the infrastructure that's built out to accommodate the production, but sort of, the infrastructure is put there by governments usually, and then they try to optimize production around the infrastructure and not the other way around. But I don't know if I'm
Well, that's an
misinterpreting
interesting way of flipping it, and I'm not sure. I mean, I guess that kind of depends on what the industry is, or no?
Well, I mean, let's say like the trains, for example. They try to sort of privatize like the train transport industry in Norway, but like none of these private companies are going to expand the amount of train tracks that are there. It's really all about just trying to squeeze the already existing kind of crumbling infrastructure.
Yes.
So, and I see that with a lot of other industries as well. It's like, okay, these private companies, like the government has built the infrastructure, and then the private companies can go and try to make a little profit on top of it. It's
But
not
you can say that, there's always a debate about the capacity of our train lines versus local, and there's always local politicians that are complaining that our roads are being ruined because there are so many lorries driving through, right? Because they need to transport the goods. And the question you need to ask yourself is, well, why does that good need to be transferred in the first place? Right? So it's not about the capacity or deciding where the train line goes. It's about why is this economic activity happening in the first place?
No, yeah, I see what you mean. It's just, I think I
Why
may
does
just
the
have a
bread need to
disagreement
be there
on.
every morning, right?
Well, I mean, it is just convenient, right? I mean, of course you
course
could
it
say
is,
that. It's
but
at what
and that's
cost, right? There's the sort of invisible cost
that's
to.
the point. You have to ask yourself, what's the cost of all of this versus someone locally baking that bread, right? Because apparently, since it's happening, some bean counter somewhere has figured out that us baking these, like a million of these types of breads and then shipping them out, as much as a hassle that is, it's still cheaper than a local baker baking the bread, as Adam Smith would have envisioned it.
Yeah, and well, usually they're correct, unless you're counting, like you said, the damage to infrastructure that comes along with that stuff.
Right.
And that is, of course, how you get a lot of this sort of modern environmentalist technocratic movements, because they're okay. We need to just recalculate, like do the green economy, where we're putting on all of these gas taxes, right? You remember when we were in England?
Yeah,
and I was riding with a lot of cabs, and they were all complaining about this sort of like zoning taxes. If they were in a certain zone, they'd have to pay for a certain pollution tax and so on. But I mean, that's where this type of stuff comes from, right? That you need to get sort of a real picture of the actual costs of doing it. But I mean, a lot of profitability, sort of the problem with markets usually is that there's these sort of hidden costs, and that's where you can make a lot of money if you figure out some place where it's like, you make the profit and you find out how to make someone else take the costs, hopefully like the taxpayer or somebody else. They're trying to fix it and maintain things, but of course the bureaucracies are just becoming unbearable for most people.
Yes. So, in the third chapter, Fleming talks about what he calls lean culture, which is the interpersonal relationships and the societal structures, I guess societal structures that need to exist for this economy to be able to function. because it might work in a vacuum, but it doesn't work if you don't have trust, etc. And this is why I'm saying this guy is kind of weird, because he starts this off by quoting Roger Scruton, of all people, about how what makes a culture, right? About how you keep a culture, pretty much. And he further writes, after quoting Scruton and Wendell Berry, he says, starting some 3 centuries ago, the market economy has, with growing confidence, been the source and framework for a loose and easygoing but effective civil society and social order. When it fades, there will be no option than to turn to a rich culture and social capital to take on this challenging role. Just stopping here for a moment, I had a thought when I read this originally. If you think to a sort of perennial mode of thinking, and picture the warrior priest and the merchant, he's in a sense saying that we've been doing the merchant thing for quite a while, and that worked out in the beginning, but now the cracks are starting to show, and that's going to fade, and you have to turn to the people who create culture, i.e. the religion, and those who enforce it, the warrior, right? I don't know if that makes any sense, but that was just a connection I felt I had when I read it.
Makes sense to me.
I'm not sure that's what he meant.
I don't think. No, I'm not saying
Yeah.
that's what he meant. That's just a connection I'm drawing. That's all. The shredding of the networks of cooperative responsibility by which people once wove a social fabric has been so savage that the possibility of a self-sufficient, empowered, and responsible citizenship is hard to recognize as an option. Yet it is the brief era of the market as the dominant source of social cohesion, no more than the interval between acts in human history, that has been the exception. Once again, we are living in the exception. You can collect a base star in the chat for Fleming. That interlude aside, the frame on which the texture of social order has been woven has not been the commerce of the market, but culture. And then he quotes Kirkpatrick Sale, blah, blah, blah. I'm going to skip this just in the interest of time. And he talks about benevolence and transparency. Benevolence in the idea of how do you ensure altruism in a society, but transparency is a bit more interesting. And I might have a quote here, but I'm going to read from the book a little bit more. So, on transparency. In principle, the idea that decisions taken by public institutions, such as hospitals and local government, should be capable of explanation in terms of established standard and transparent procedures is, of course, reasonable. It provides protection from allegations of unfairness. It saves time on detail. But there are problems. Full transparency means that someone who took no part in the decision making can know or find out pretty well everything relevant about the decision and how it was arrived at. There is a lot to be said for that, but when everything about a decision is clear, there is no need or no space to take anything on trust. In fact, there are many circumstances in which transparency does not and cannot exist. The central point of the question of trust is whether you can trust the person to make a good decision, rational, with positive consequences for the people involved, even though you don't know the full circumstances of the case, and you may never know. You may not know the person or people involved in the decision. You may not even know you may not even know that the decision has been made. It is in these circumstances, in which neither transparency nor indeed accountability and human rights apply, that the question of trust is not only crucial, but it arises also as a universal and daily event. We may not know, nor have any particular expectations about what others are going to do, even in cases where their actions will significantly affect us, and especially in new situations where no established principles exist. You do, of course, have reasonable expectations about what your airline pilot will do and what the driver coming in the opposite direction of you will do. And you can call that trust if you like. But if you think that is the extent of it, you are missing the point, and expectation might be better. Trust is about the conditions in which, despite the lack of transparency, accountability, and a significant contribution from human rights, you are confined to believe that the other person will get it right. Which to me just basically describes a nobility. I don't know about you. We talked
I
about
mean,
like him being like a medievalist.
yeah.
He's essentially just describing a lord.
But I mean, this is kind of the natural state of things, right? Where like the trust you have in families and individuals is everything.
Yeah.
And I mean, we're one step away from honor culture. Really, that's kind of where I see
Kind
this
of, yeah.
going.
I can
Well,
keep
I mean,
going with
it
this.
is kind of inevitable. If you look at the societies that have sort of resisted, let's say in the Middle East, for example, say like Pakistan or other countries that sort of actively resist being market sort of opened up to global markets, it's because they are sort of tightly knit into these kind of like family and honor structures. You just have to hope that it doesn't end with continual blood feuds, and that they can figure out something else to do with their time rather than just perpetuating grudges from 200 years ago.
Yes.
But, I mean, there are positives and negatives to it. Of course, I see all of the negative sides to like the market economy, the sort of neoliberal landscape that we're living in. But there are some sort of like third world elements that I'm just not such a fan of. Some people who just want to live in Planet of the Apes in a sense. Even in this movement, and I'm kind of not a fan of it. Even if that makes me somewhat progressive, I'm not sure I would appreciate living in that society, to be honest.
Well, that's kind of the thing. Are you going to be defeatist about things and say that, I'm just waiting for the collapse? Or are you going to try to go with the flow here and use the tools available to you, right? And I think, obviously, Fleming is someone who's just waiting for the collapse, just from a very different perspective than, billions must die, chud guy online.
Yeah, I'm just happy that there's, I mean, you said it was utopian. I don't really think it is. I think most of the descriptions that he's given are quite sober and accurate in terms of how like this non-market system would actually function. He doesn't say that this society would be like feminist or multicultural or any that they would produce.
Well, I
Everybody
can
would just
find his
produce
passage
culture
on
and
multiculturalism here in a moment. Let me see. I have those then seem to be the choices. That's the okay. So he has like 4 pages on it. So I'm gonna see if I can just read the conclusion here. It is also conceivable that a protective membrane could form around different cultures without there being any implication of boundaries defined in terms of place, that is, without concentration of any one culture in any one location. Some scope for this is undoubtedly possible. Baghdad, for instance, was for many centuries rich with diverse religions, with a famously thriving Jewish community. But there are limits, because all social order and collective action requires a framework of institutions, a local community, places of worship, schools, clubs, neighborhood associations, the rules and assumptions which guide decision making. If those institutions themselves differ, then the public sphere fails, collective action becomes hard, or it becomes impossible. Institutions such as schools cannot even enjoy internal cultural celebration if whichever one it chooses to do is offensive to some or most of its members. If no particular collective action is in fact needed because the economy is so prosperous, there may be no problem for a time. Fresh Prince, anyone? But if that should change, then the lack of an agreed set of institutional assumptions will cause trouble. Local communities whose internal cohesion is defined in terms of opposition to the rest can be expected, and even if that trouble is mitigated, that task itself may absorb so much energy that little remains for the positive collective task of making a future. And yet, the celebration of cultural differences and mutual respect has a natural rightness about it. There can be doubt as to how deeply it penetrates. Brave affirmative dialogue between the imam and the rabbi does not necessarily extend among all their followers, nor among all their leaders, but it is a first step. Those then seem to be the choices. Either a heroic attempt to build a new common culture, a common narrative or social covenant, or strong, distinctive local cultures sharing a mutual respect for their common experience or of religious faith and legitimized by their distinctiveness and notably by their arts, which can communicate across boundaries better than plain words. Failing these, the default position is the absence of any culture at all, since each is diluted out of sight. This last is only a realistic option in a rich economy where consumption keeps the peace, and in fact, all the concerned and urgent suggestions about ways to modify multiculturalism and create a peaceful and collective identity are made on the assumption that energy, food, taxes, and jobs will continue in good order. When that no longer holds, difficult revision is likely. So he's a bit, boomer about some of this, but I think he has a couple of lines in there that very well expresses a lot of the issues that we're facing now on account of multiculturalism, or sort of putting the finger on the idea that, well, yeah, as long as the line went up, we were happy being multicultural, but it's not going up anymore. So
It's not delivering, folks. we
We,
were able to put up
you
with
know,
it. Yeah, we were putting up with it as long as the
left
that's
has
the
gone too
stock
far.
market. They did. But I feel like many people are feeling like that. They were willing to sort of put up with immigration and stuff as long as there's the stock market was going up and their portfolios were doing well and they could buy more products and services. But when that is no longer delivered, they're going to start looking at other things and blaming people. Yeah, I mean, I'm sounding like lefty now, but I mean, I think it's just natural. Where I'm seeing it already with the sort of slow growth of the economy and the increased inflation. That people are just becoming greedier. They're less willing to pay for stuff and less trusting as well. I think so. It is a kind of reversion, and weirdly enough, it is like this is what I want in a sense. But it's
well, yes. The problem is that
I'm living in it though, so it's
we haven't been able to fall back on anything in it, right? It just becomes like base, animal cruelty, I guess, instead of falling back on a social cohesion baseline, right?
Yeah, I agree.
millions won't pay.
Kids won't pay. And I'm quickly just going to go back to on the issue of transparency, and we have some time. I can read both. A second problem with transparency is that it can affect the quality of decisions. There is a raft of decisions that can be based on routine procedures. Think of medicine, for instance. But there are also judgments requiring the application of imagination and thought, which will on that account involve the acceptance of some degree of risk, for which the person who has applied the thought will bear some responsibility. Routine decisions are transparent. The imaginative ones are not. Given a commitment to risk reduction and the rules of transparency, the only option is to stick to the routine. When something unexpected happens, it will fall outside the scope of the routine decision, so transparency will get it wrong. The needed risk is not taken. Well-placed trust, O'Neill states. He's talking about Reith lecturer Onara O'Neill. Well-placed trust, O'Neill states, grows out of active inquiry rather than blind acceptance. For surviving the future, that's well-placed expectation. What we will need in the future is reasonable confidence that when people whom we scarcely know do unfamiliar things in circumstances which we cannot guess at, and which may not be what we would have done, which may not be what we would have done, there is a good chance that what they do is right. And now for a third difficulty with transparency. On closer inspection, it turns out that there is no such thing. Decisions in a transparent system depend on premises and presumptions which are quite arbitrary. Principles which seems to be too obvious to need any defense. Quote, I think children should be allowed to follow their natural inclinations, which is the Montessori approach, if I remember. The platitudes of good intention, the avoidances of judgment, and the presumed meanings of fairness and moral authority are in fact propositions which, if they were reached by argument, would depend on a complex, closely analyzed case. The reason that kind of argument is so dominant is not that it has been constructed, but that it's just been adopted as self-evident. But the self-evident is a shedload of marginal assumptions, previous judgments, and prejudice. Transparency then trivializes trust down to the level of expectation, It diminishes decisions to the level of the safe, the routine, the easily defended, and reinforces faith in the self-evident, which is subject to no examination at all. No, transparency is far from being a condition for the existence of trust. If we want a way to reassure ourselves that our trust is warranted, what we're seeking is congruence. And then he talks about congruence for a while. But I don't really want to get into that right now. I just find it interesting how he, in so many other words, keep sort of hitting neo-reactionary feudalistic points. It's very interesting to me. It is activating
It's almost like
my
he hits
almonds.
them. It's almost like he hits them inevitably.
Well, yes, maybe. And he does say that when he starts talking about sort of like potential structures for societies. He's very clear on the fact that there's going to have to be a hierarchy of some sort, though he hedges and says that, you know, it's not a lord or a burgermeister, it's a council, maybe, right? To at least have the semblance of democracy.
Yeah.
But he seems to be under no. It is strange because a lot of the economic terms or sort of when he's talking about things in economic terms, he seems to be thinking from a bottom-up perspective. But in terms of a social structure, he's thinking from a top-down perspective, as I said earlier. And it's a very weird combination. Maybe it's not to people listening, but I find it interesting. All right. So do I have one more? Let's require people to go. Oh, well, he's talking about, he goes into the Slack economy more in detail, and then he talks about the carnival. But then we're getting into part 2, which is basically he's trying to reclaim the importance of relaxation and play and rituals. Looking back on sort of, you know, the old chestnut of, you know, a farmer in medieval Europe had more time off than someone working a regular job has today, right?
Mm-hmm.
So that might be something we can go into the next time, because I think we're coming up on like almost 1.5 hours now. Because he has something called the Slack economy in here as well. He talks about eroticism, which I I really enjoyed him talking about. So we're probably going to have to do a part 2 on this now that I'm looking at it. But what are your thoughts so far? Let's start with that.
I was surprised to hear, you know, when you're looking at his picture, you sort of don't think that he's going to be saying these sorts of things. And then that when he actually starts writing, a lot of the conclusions are almost Hoppian in some sense.
Right. But he's envisioning sort of like a weird Hoppian patchwork future where, you know, you're living in.
I think it's precisely not Hoppian, actually. I mean, with Hoppe, it's really more based around the market and how you make the market survive. But for Fleming, that's not a concern at all. It's really just trying to break away from a lot of those principles. True. Even though they might arrive at similar, you know, like pre-modern structures for society, I think they're quite different.
Yeah, there's obviously difference. Yeah.
Well, maybe I'm conflating it with like just general paleo-libertarianism. That's probably it. Anyway, I think the point still stands that it's strange that he's attacking this from a. I think the environment is going to suffer, and what we're doing now isn't going to survive. So we're going to have to come up with a more sustainable, long-term way of preserving both our society and the environment. And what he ends up describing is a weird patchwork feudalism like medieval Europe, in my opinion.
Mm-hmm.
Just with more windmills or whatever, I guess. Something like that.
More windmills to tilt at.
Yes. Billions must spin. All right. I think on that note, hopefully you listening found some enjoyment in this. Maybe you learned something. I found this book very interesting, and I think we should at some point do a part 2 where he dives deeper into the more cultural aspects of his potential future society.
The metaphysics of post-industrial sex. That's going to be the next episode.
Yes, the place of rediscovering eroticism in the post-industrial society. Pretty much what he's talking about. Thank you everyone for watching. Next week, if I remember correctly, Luddic Path, we will have. Is that Nathan Hood next week, or is that in 2 weeks?
So I'm checking the dates now. If it's the 4th of May, and it is, yeah, then we'll have Nathan Hood on to talk about monkeys.
So it's Nathan Hood to talk about monkeys and chimpanzee politics. And in 2 weeks, literally in 2 weeks, because on the Wednesday the 10th, if everything goes to plan, we have scheduled a talk with Dr. Edward Dutton on the geniuses who are trying to save humanity through breeding. And we might have something more in the pipeline, but I don't remember right now. So thank you everyone for watching, and we'll see you next week. Bye-bye.